Having been brought up on a farm in Scotland, scientist Alexander Fleming wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty, examining nasty bacteria like Staphylococcus aureus, which in humans, as well as horses, can cause death, as well as vomiting and boils. One day, in 1928, Fleming came back from his holidays. He found some cultures of the Staphylococcus aureus bacteria, which he'd meant to throw away, had died. But instead of throwing them away, he stopped to think what might have caused some of his sample to die and the rest to live. After a lot of time and effort in his lab, Fleming worked out that some of his sample had been contaminated by a particular fungus, which he then managed to grow himself. As an ex-soldier in World War I, he'd seen hundreds of soldiers die due to bacterial infection, and he figured that if the fungus could kill bacteria on his bench, it might also kill bacteria in wounded soldiers. And he was right. Having renamed his mould juice penicillin, it was ready for public consumption in time for the next war on D-Day. Penicillin has saved the lives of millions of people and horses. But due to overuse, some bacteria is becoming resistant, and methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus is now widespread among humans, known by its more popular name, MRSA.
Where does bread get its fluffiness, Swiss cheese its holes, and what makes vinegar so sour? These foods may taste completely different, but all of these phenomena come from tiny organisms chowing down on sugar and belching up some culinary byproducts. Let's start with yeast. Yeast are single-celled fungi used to make bread, beer, and wine, among other products. Yeast break down carbohydrates like sugar to get energy and the molecules they need to function. They have two different ways to do this, the oxygen-dependent or aerobic pathway and the oxygen-independent anaerobic pathway, which is also called fermentation. When you bake bread, yeast can use both pathways, but they normally prefer to start with the anaerobic process of fermentation. In this process, ethanol is produced in addition to CO2. No, bread isn't alcoholic. Small amounts of alcohol that are secreted evaporate during baking. In the aerobic or oxygen-dependent pathway, the yeast consumes some of the sugar and produce carbon dioxide gas, or CO2, and water. In both processes, the CO2 accumulates and creates tiny bubbles. These bubbles get trapped by gluten and create a sponge-like structure that gives the bread its soft texture. Wine also relies on yeast, but a winemaking setup keeps the oxygen levels low. so that yeast consume sugar using fermentation, the anaerobic pathway. The process often starts with wild yeasts already hanging out on the grapes. But to get consistent results, most winemakers also add carefully selected strains of yeast that can tolerate high levels of alcohol. The yeast consume the sugar in the grape juice, and as the sugar level drops, the alcohol level rises. This doesn't necessarily mean that sweeter wines have less alcohol. Different types of grapes start with different amounts of sugar, and sugar can also be added. What happens to the carbon dioxide? It just bubbles away through a vent. In carbonated alcoholic beverages like champagne and beer, sealed containers are used in primary or secondary fermentation to keep the carbon dioxide in the bottle. Wine also introduces us to our second type of food-producing microorganism, bacteria. A special strain of bacteria turns a tart compound in grape juice into softer tasting ones that are responsible for some of the flavors in red wines and Chardonnays. Another type of bacteria, called acetic acid bacteria, isn't so desirable in wine, but they have their function too. If there's oxygen around, these bacteria convert the ethanol in wine into, well, acetic acid. Let this process continue, and you'll eventually get vinegar. Bacteria are the key for cheese, too. To make cheese, milk is inoculated with bacteria. The bacteria gobble up the lactose, a kind of sugar, and produce lactic acid, along with many other chemicals. As the milk gets more and more acidic, its proteins start to aggregate and curdle. That's why spoiled milk is clumpy. Cheesemakers usually add an enzyme called rennet, naturally found inside of cows, goats, and some other mammals, to help this process along. Eventually, those little curdles turn into bigger curds, which are pressed to squeeze out the water and create a firm cheese. Different strains of bacteria make different kinds of cheese. For example, a species of bacteria that emits carbon dioxide is what gives Swiss cheese its characteristic holes. Some cheeses, Brie and Camembert, use another kind of microorganism too, mold. So your kitchen functions as a sort of biotechnology lab, manned by microorganisms that culture your cuisine. Yogurt, soy sauce, sour cream, sauerkraut, kefir, kimchi, kombucha, cheddar, challah, pita, and naan. But maybe not all at the same dinner.
Oil. We burn up or otherwise consume some 90 million barrels of the goop every day. That ends up making a mess. According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, there are an average of 70 spills every day. Mostly insignificant. Every once in a while, we make a spectacular mess, like the punctured Exxon Valdez oil tanker off the coast of Alaska, or BP's blown-out Macondo well at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. When humans make a big mess like that, humans try to clean it up. We corral it with booms or burn it off, but whatever we miss ends up getting eaten by microscopic bugs. In fact, bacteria and other microbes are one of the main reasons that BP's Gulf oil spill wasn't a bigger disaster. A big bloom of bugs ate most of the 4.1 million barrels of oil spilled before it could wash into wetlands or tar sea creatures. How big was the bloom? 100 sextillion microbial cells big. Here's how they work. Oil has been a part of life on Earth for eons, and microbes evolved to take advantage of that. Tiny bacterium feast on the oil and gas seeping from the bottom of the seafloor or bubbling to the surface. They're not necessarily fast, but they are thorough, turning loose hydrocarbons into more microbial cells. But microbes don't only eat oil. Plastics, often made from oil, get everywhere too. For example, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is made up of tiny grains of plastic and the occasional grocery bag. It's actually proved to be a hospitable home for plastic-eating microbes and other microscopic life. This new ecosystem has been dubbed the plastosphere. On their own, microbes would probably take eons to clean up our plastic mess. But with synthetic biology, we could tweak these little friends and help speed up that process. We could help them to help us. Scientists have been working on souping up microbes' ability to eat oil for decades. The very first genetically modified organism to be patented was an oil-eating microbe way back in 1980. There's no reason that plastic eaters couldn't be enhanced in the same way. It's obviously better to avoid trashing plastic and dumping oil in the first place. But since we're a messy bunch, it's a good thing we have microbes around to help us clean up. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm David Biello.